So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our finance panel. We're going to try and keep this brisk and running through because, like all our panels today, we have a relatively short window, but I hope we'll have a very interesting discussion while we're doing it. So the road to Belém goes through finance. The last few years, I think you'll agree, all seem to have been the year of the finance COP. But this time, there really is a very specific, hard deadline to agree a new collective quantified goal, and that is focusing a lot of people's attention. Selwyn Hart spoke to the importance of that goal, providing predictability and certainty for forward financing of the climate transition. So the third Paris goal, the one that deals with finance, it gets relatively little discussion, mainly because countries have historically been divided on what it takes to implement it. And meanwhile, the financial system itself is run by technocrats. They have a system that sits in parallel to the multilateral diplomatic system. However, over the last couple of years, discussions about overall financial system reform, reform of international financial architecture, have brought diplomats and technocrats into the same conversations across the UNFCCC agenda, also across G20 and G7 agendas, and in other multilateral forums as well. Now, different actors in this conversation have got different goals. So those goals include massive mobilization of finance to achieve global climate safety, but they also include managing and avoiding financial risks that could derail the transition almost before it gets started. And climate risk is unique in being systemic, inevitable, and unavoidable. So these agendas can and should come together, and must do so fast, in a way that delivers finance to where it's needed and at the right scale. So that's what we're talking about today. Our panelists each bring unique opportunities to discuss this challenge from very different perspectives. So I'm going to introduce each of them in turn and invite each of them to give some opening remarks that speak to some of the dilemmas and some of the necessities around the financial system change agenda. Our first panelist is Dr. Vera Songwe. Dr. Songwe is a senior advisor to the Bank of International Settlements, and she currently co-chairs the G20 expert group on climate finance and debt, otherwise known as TF-Klima. She's also the co-chair of the independent high-level expert panel on climate finance, alongside Sir Nicholas Stern. She's also the former United Nations Under-Secretary General and the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. She's the first woman to lead that organization in 60 years. So E3G has more than once had the honor of working directly with Dr. Songwe, most recently to support the development of her recent publication that was called Unlocking Private Capital to Emerging Markets and Developing Countries in a Time of Crisis. So Dr. Songwe, I'm hoping all our tech works and that you're able to provide us with some introductory remarks. And Vera has left Zoom. All right, so no problem. I'll next introduce our next panelist, Paul Bodnar, who's the Director of Sustainable Finance, Industry and Diplomacy at the Bezos Earth Fund. So Paul has worked on climate finance issues from a wide range of perspectives himself in recent years, and has served in the Adama White House as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change at the National Security Council, having previously been the US lead negotiator for climate finance. So since moving on from government, Paul founded the Center for Climate Aligned Finance at RMI, was Global Head of Sustainable Investing at BlackRock, and is now Director of Sustainable Finance, Industry and Diplomacy at the Bezos Earth Fund. So, Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Thank you for the invitation to be here in this magnificent venue. So, this topic is sort of infinitely complex, so I'm going to try to focus on a couple of things that I think are particularly important that have arisen in the last couple of years. And I'm going to offer 4 themes to watch for in the next 12 months or so that I think are really, really important. And based on doing this for 25 years, I think are some of the most important topics that we all should focus on and support in this agenda. I think the 2 really interesting things that have happened in the last few years, among others, okay, but one actually Adama will speak about, and that's the rise of public development banks, not MDBs, but national development banks and other forms of national or regional financial institutions in the public finance system. and the degree to which they've been organized and organized themselves into groups like the International Development Finance Club and now Finance in Common. I really think that's actually a very important development, and I'll explain why when I touch on what I think we need to watch for in the next 12 months. The second is actually the realization that when it comes to climate finance, we can't just be tracking green investment, right? The Copenhagen Accord, the Paris Agreement has this $100 billion goal, which I was involved in negotiating, stories to be provided later over a drink, but that's only really part of the story, right? You can't just count up the number of green pounds or green dollars and have an idea about whether finance is flowing to the right places. You have to count the other side of the equation, which is how much investment is flowing into fossil energy, and very importantly, how fast are we retiring the assets, the sticky, long life assets that actually account for global emissions today. We are headed for a long plateau in global emissions. And the reason is we're doing a pretty good job of making all new investment in the energy system, or much of it, clean. But we are going to be living with these existing assets for a very long time. Coal-fired power plants, natural gas, fossil-based industry, unless we can find a fair way to actually retire those early. And that's an agenda that has really come to life in the last few years, and it's very, very important. Very quickly, I think there are 4 things to watch for in the next year or two. The first, building on the organization of public development banks, is the decentralization of the climate finance agenda. We, to an extent which I think most people are not even conscious of most of the time, obsess about north to south, obsess about the tinkering with institutions of the global north or multilateral institutions and trying to make a better 3,000-mile long screwdriver between London and Nairobi, or between Washington and, you know, and Latin America. What we actually need to be doing is helping developing countries to design their own national financial capacity to drive this transition and make all of the multilateral institutions a supporting cast instead of the main players in the story. So I think that will start to come into sharper focus as more and more countries implement national green investment banks, following the good example of the UK and others. The second is the dog that didn't bark for a long time in the financial system is the insurance industry. And finally, the insurance industry is getting engaged in this. You would think that insurance companies within the financial sector would be in the lead, and they should have been for the last 30 years, and now they're finally getting there. Some of you might have attended a great event that Howden put on yesterday, a great sign of that, and I think you'll see more from the insurance industry finally, and you should demand it. The third is net zero transition plans, and E3G has been a leader in this space. Yesterday we saw the announcement that the IFRS will take up the further development of net zero transition plans. I can't underline how important it would be if jurisdictions like the UK and the EU and others adopted mandatory net zero transition plans for emitting corporates. That is the corporate equivalent of an NDC. and it would be a game changer if that were mandatory. And finally, climate resilience. This has been understood. Climate adaptation finance has been understood as a line item in a government budget as far as financial markets are concerned. It's not. Unfortunately, climate resilience is a growth industry in the 21st century. And it's like healthcare. It's unfortunate that people get sick, but we do want capital to flow into the healthcare industry and drive innovation in drugs and treatments and so on, right? Same for climate resilience. We want the products and services and technologies that are in demand in a warming world to be something that capital markets focus on. You want your retirement, believe me, part of your retirement to be invested in companies that are providing resilience solutions because it is going to be a growth, it is already a growth industry. So helping capital markets, private finance understand climate resilience solutions as an investment area to be just as excited about as decarbonization is the last thing I'll mention.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Paul. That's a great starter for the discussion. So I'd like to come now to our final panelist. So Adama Mariko is the Deputy Director, Secretary General for Finance and Common, and the Deputy Director for Mobilisation, Partnerships and Communication at the Agence Française de Développement. So Adama is a champion of multilateral collaboration on development finance and has created a global network of public development banks which work towards collective ambitious goals. Adama has previously worked for AFD on the ground in West Africa and in the Indian Ocean, as well as in its Paris headquarters, including as a member of the AFD Management Board. So we're so pleased to have you with us, Adama. Please, please carry on.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Actually, I totally agree with what Paul just said, and I'm going to just probably focus more on the public development bank side, right? We are speaking about global crisis and global climate crisis, and I think this also means that the financial system at its own has to rethink itself. And we start hearing that a lot in the global reforms that are going on within the G20, the discussions that are upcoming within the UN Summit for the Future, and the preparation of the next Financing for Development Summit. And just have that in mind as well. All the solutions you can bring in the international discussion, please prepare it for the next FFD Summit, because it will be 10 years after the Paris Agreement, 10 years after the Addis Ababa Action Plan, and 10 years after the SDGs. So this is when we take stock on these reforms we have been implementing and to adjust, probably not for 2030, but at least we can have a joint common boussole on those three agendas. So within this agenda, and just building on what Paul just said, the global crisis needs also sometimes local solutions, and adapting the solutions is really, the way to go for me. So by saying that, and also having in mind that if we speak about the risk management, mainly when you have the risk, it's because you have some uncertainty, and you lack probably of information. So who has that? We often forget that there is 530 30 public development banks in the world. Within those 530 public development banks in the world, only 10% have international activities. The one you heard about every time, the MDBs, banks like AFD, etc., etc. The rest of them work for the national ground, work for the national countries. And they are all over the place, in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, in the US, etc., etc. So, regarding the point also Paul was mentioning on the stock we have, if you look at the 23 trillions under management within the public development bank's assets, 80% of that amount is in the G20 countries. This also shows you how those development banks was investing in the national economy, and probably where the stock of carbon has been built as well, probably with the national development banks somehow in those countries, right? But let's see the other part of the solution. It is also, a hope for the countries that are still young economies, having their financial system growing, being strengthened, to have these national development banks also be part of the solution on helping the government preparing the projects. And this is also something we really want to have in this discussion, because mainly you have projects prepared from Washington, London, Paris or Brussels to be implemented in, I'm not sure, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, etc. Of course, you have risk asymmetry and information asymmetry. If you don't rely on the national institutions that know better their own policy framework, that invest also in their countries, and they are the first that reduce the risk somehow. And they are the one de-risking their own private sector in the country. And they are the one creating also the enabling system for investment. And somehow, even when we speak about this enabling system, we often also think of this as enabling the private sector. Of course, it is important, but enabling sustainable finance should be the common basis on enabling for the private sector or others. And having the public institutions, the public development banks, that are the SDG enablers for their own countries is really useful. So how do we do that? It's also, useful to have in mind that these banks need to be aligned. We cannot just say that there is public development banks existing, but they have to be their mandate focused on SDGs, being more focused on what matters. We're speaking about 2.5 trillion of annual investment capacity, and these are not pledges, it's actually the investment they are making already. Of course, there is some allocation, misallocation discussion we have to solve, because investing in Europe is not the same that investing in Africa or Latin America, but somehow we are speaking about 2.5 trillion of annual flows that these institutions are bringing in the system. So if we help those institutions to be aligned, meaning that they are only focused on investing in SDGs and not harm them, we are solving a part of the 100 billion problem, actually, because focusing on 100 billion donation between the north of the south is forgetting that there is actually flows that are probably misused, and these where the quality side of the discussion also has been looked at. So local solution through the development bank ecosystem. So that's what we do within the financing common system. It's mainly to help to gather these institutions, to have a right division of labor between the multilateral institutions, the regional institutions, and the national development banks. This is the whole community of public development banks, not just the multilateral ones. I'm really glad to hear multilateral institutions working as a system, but let's think the system being wider than 50 banks. It's like also having the national institutions. And by saying that, it's also on the governments, because they are shareholders of those multilateral institutions, pushing a hard climate agenda and linking development with climate. And I'm really supportive of this push from the government. But those same government at the multilateral level have those national institutions as well. If you don't align the mandate of your national institutions with the international agenda you are pushing, somehow we are missing something. Right? So that's where we think that having this also community to work together is really useful. Involving the public development banks also in defining the policies and the regulatory discussions is really useful. And I've seen in some countries, and we can take examples, for instance, in Rwanda or Ghana, where the national development institutions are working with their regulatory body to build, taxonomy for climate finance for the private sector and the capital market in the areas. And I think also this is where connecting those national institutions with the international standards is useful, because they help also their own governments to transform the ecosystem and to enable the sustainable finance. I'm going to stop here. I have a lot to say again, but please, if you have any question, we can go deeper.
Thank you very much. So both of you in different ways have given a really impassioned call to, have action for climate led out of the recipient countries, effectively to have finance ministers use the full range of levers available to them when they are sort of planning their economic transition in their countries, making their NDCs investable, and to effectively bring down some of the risk in the system by having that much better managed in country. This is a really compelling vision, and then in the context of broader international rule changes and standards and so on, which are also important. It's compelling, but it's very different to, well, it's potentially very different to the politics of the NCQ negotiation this year, which is crucial for that road to Belém and for generally ensuring sufficient trust in the multilateral climate negotiations to move forward to the enhanced NDCs we want to see in 2025. So I'd love to hear from each of you, how you think that might be squared. What would we ideally want to see from the NCQG this year that will help us achieve this broader change and also keep the negotiations on track? So Paul first. So a small question.
Well, I'm afraid that what makes sense for a goal-setting exercise like that in the context of the UNFCCC politics has wandered farther and farther and farther away from what's actually useful in the world. And so I think if you're solving that puzzle for inside the UNFCCC negotiations logic, that's one thing. If you want that negotiation to yield an outcome that actually influences change in the world, it's a different thing. And I'm not super optimistic that we're going to get the latter. I think if we wanted to advocate for an outcome where nations agree on a quantitative goal for climate finance, to me that quantitative goal is 100% alignment. In other words, climate alignment has become a very powerful paradigm in the financial sector, and it goes beyond, again, adding up the green dollars. So whether the green dollar number is 100 billion or some other number, it's obviously much, much higher, as we heard from Selwyn. And it saddens me that we seem to never be able to get beyond the original politics of North-South climate finance. The Paris Agreement was a breakthrough for mitigation. It was a breakthrough for transparency. It changed the paradigm. It changed very little for finance. Finance is the one where we're still living in the sort of political logic and language of 1992. And so, again, if we want to make the UNFCCC negotiations relevant for action, we would couch that goal as climate alignment. You can still have a quantitative goal for mobilizing North-South climate finance within that. But the really impactful thing is if countries commit to policies and measures that align their financial systems with net zero goals, which means new investment in fossil. It means programs to spur the early retirement of fossil assets. Otherwise, again, we're going to be living in a long plateau of high emissions for some time to come.
Okay, thanks, Paul. A good provocation there. Adama.
Yeah, my expectation is that, I'm not into the politics of negotiation. Paul knows that very, very better than me. But I think in these negotiations, somehow, there must be a sense of responsibility at the end. We cannot be focused on the North-South discussion while also we see progress ongoing. And also, we should acknowledge the responsibility of, the southern, part of the world. I've seen NDCs from countries that are poor, that are more, ambitious than northern countries that didn't publish their NDCs yet. So somehow there will be also a sense of responsibility in these global discussions. But just coming back to the solution-oriented, whatever the results are in the negotiation, I think that they should keep, the ambition high for the financial system to keep allowing the investment on the ground. If we get into any solution that come with some more fragmentation in the taxonomies, et cetera, we will lose the pattern of the investment. So for me, it's really important that we keep looking at existing solutions, scaling them and having the private capital and the public finance being mobilized as much as possible. For instance, I'm going to mention two examples we are working on. If you look at the discussion regarding the CRDCs, and the fact that you have several institutions implementing them.
So you might want to spell out the acronym for the audience, because
sorry.
You might want to just explain what CRDCs
okay.
are.
Climate resilience debt clauses, which is for financial institutions mainly to bring some kind of assurance solution if you have climate crisis, so they would suspend the service of the debt, for instance. So at least explaining that and having common principles on how to implement it throughout the financial system is something useful for the system, actually. And also, we have seen many financial innovation going on, and some countries, implementing it, debt for climate swaps and debt for nature swaps, etc. So having also a clear, mapping on how we do it can help the financial institutions to not waste time on figuring out how they should chip in and develop these kind of operations. And of course, the capital market as well should have clearer visibility on what is sustainable finance and how the investments that are used by the corporate or the financial institutions can be clearly reported to the the capital market, so they can also get into these kind of operations, help the investments, and move the financial flows also in this regard. So I think those also are some specific items where we should have clarity in the international negotiations and setting the path for that.
Great, thank you very much. Now, our technical team's been working in the background very hard trying to bring Dr. Vera Songwe back, but unfortunately has not managed it, which means that I get the pleasure of springing a surprise question on our panelists. Paul, I think you might be able to field this one, and it's one of the questions that was asked by our audience in advance when they registered. They were also keen to know about the NCQG, I should add. But one of the things that we've been seeing in the last year or so is a real backlash towards ESG in particular. That's environmental, social governance investment, for those of you who aren't into that acronym. And then more broadly, political backlash to the costs of net zero. Can I ask you on your feet to give us any thoughts on how that can be combated in the climate finance space?
Yeah, well, I experienced this directly when I was at BlackRock, and it was really amazing to see how quickly the momentum in favor of sustainable investing sort of ground to a halt and started to reverse. I do think that we shouldn't forget that we had a couple of years of very elevated energy prices, conventional energy prices, during the supply shock after COVID, or as part of the COVID response, and then of course due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, and it was also during that period that if you were an investor, these conventional energy companies were massively outperforming the market, not just renewables, but everything else. So if you looked at charts by sector of how companies were performing, conventional energy was by far the most outperforming sector for a couple of years. And that really spooked a number of investors, portfolio managers, right, who were starting to get comfortable with tilting away from those conventional energy because the ones that weren't were outperforming them and were doing better, and their clients were doing better, and that really was, I think we're still kind of experiencing, even though the energy system has moved on from that episode largely, we're still experiencing that, and even though we're getting inflation under control. The ESG backlash, I think, was the result of two things. One is that there was what I would describe a healthy reckoning within the financial markets over what ESG actually means and what it's good for and what we should use it for, right? It originally involved as a set of actually risk-adjusted performance enhancing tools so you understand if you're investing in companies, you want to understand some of the things that are not on financial statements and how they can affect the future profitability of companies, and you want to take that into account where it's financially material in security selection, for example, if you're managing public funds. So that's fine. But then it started, the same data sets, the same ESG data sets started to be used by those who were interested in financial products that advanced sustainability objectives or outcomes in the world. And the two got a little bit mixed up, and regulators started to step in the EU first with the sustainable disclosure regulation and so on, and then in the UK, and that's all fine. That sort of sorts itself out over time. But it also became politicized, especially in the United States, in the middle of that process. And so ESG was plucked out and made into a political artifact whose story and narrative was sort of disconnected from the market reckoning and the improvement in financial regulations around labeling and so on. So unfortunately, all of that has combined to. I think it's sort of healthy. I think the world kind of needs to move on from ESG. I mean, as a concept, as an integrated concept. There are not very many use cases for having one ESG score for a company that tries to sweep up all of these various factors into a single score. So I think the financial sector will move on and innovate in sustainable investing, but the political stuff is on its own track, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. And we're basically at time now. So I'd like to thank our panel both very warmly for participating. And we've gone into a number of key topics here. I wish we had more time. I'm sure that they'll both be happy to chat in coffee breaks and so on afterwards if you are able to catch them. But in the meantime, can I please just thank both Paul Bodnar and Adama Mariko very much for your contributions today.
Thank you, Kate.